Projet de loi S5.
Rapporté.
Stand.
Numéro 2, projet de loi C-15.
Senator LaBoucane-Benson.
Honourable Senators, I move that this bill be read a second time.
It is moved by the Honourable Senator LaBoucane-Benson, seconded by the Honourable Senator Gold, that the bill be read a second time. On debate, Senator LaBoucane-Benson.
Honourable Senators, it's my profound honour to rise in this chamber today as sponsor of Bill C-15, an act respecting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the work of the Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples, which has undertaken an extensive review of the subject matter of the bill. I thank all of my colleagues on the committee, particularly the leadership of Senator Christmas's chair, for the good work we've been able to achieve. Colleagues, this is an historic government bill which will provide a solid foundation for the Government of Canada's implementation of the Declaration. You may recall that UNDRIP was adopted by the General Assembly in September 2007 after decades of work by dedicated Indigenous people across Canada and globally. I'd like to specifically acknowledge Cree lawyer, Chief Dr. Wilton Littlechild, who chaired many tables at the UN and has worked tirelessly for over 4 decades with the ultimate goal of realizing true human rights for the Indigenous peoples of Canada. Canada adopted the Declaration in 2010 with some reservations and fully in 2016. I remind the Honourable Senators that in 2019, the House of Commons extensively studied and passed Romeo Saganash's Private Members Bill C-262. It was also studied by the Senate, but died on our order paper at the end of the Parliament. You will also remember that the Government of Canada committed to introducing similar legislation as a government bill in June 2019, in this very chamber, in fact, and further reiterated in the 2020 Speech from the Throne that the UN Declaration is key in advancing reconciliation in Canada. I want to acknowledge the many Indigenous people who have worked on the adoption and implementation of this critical human rights instrument in the Canadian context. In addition, many prayers have been offered at traditional ceremonies across the country to support this effort. I feel very humble to be a very small part of this important movement and help Canada get to the next step in the reconciliation process. I want to thank you in advance, Honourable Senators, for your thoughtful consideration of this momentous bill. I wish to acknowledge the efforts of the Minister of Justice, who introduced Bill C-15, supported by the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. Using Bill 262 as a basis for discussions and dialogue, the Government of Canada held over 70 engagement sessions with Indigenous leaders and other Indigenous partners, including modern treaty and self-governing groups, rights holders, as well as Indigenous women's organization, Indigenous youth, and LGBTQ2S+ groups. Much of the input and advice that was heard is reflected in Bill C-15. Changes made to the Bill 262 include clearly recognizing in the preamble the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples and reflecting the importance of respecting treaties and agreements, emphasizing the need to take the diversity of Indigenous peoples into account during implementation of the bill, and more robust provisions relating to developing and tabling the action plan and annual reports, to name a few. The Government of Canada also held discussions with natural resource sectors and provincial and territorial governments. However, I would be remiss if I did not mention that it is also true that some treaty rights holders do not feel that they have been properly consulted in the development of this bill. In their written submissions and witness testimony, they made it clear that while they support UNDRIP, they are not satisfied with the way in which this bill was developed. In my discussion with chiefs, particularly in Alberta, it has become very clear that they worry about the work on UNDRIP will become a distraction for the federal government from their duty to fulfill the obligations of treaty, some of which have been outstanding for over a century. Truthfully, though, the UNDRIP articles should help treaty rights holders to finally realize the promise of treaties. But I do not blame any chief or leader who does not trust any government. There's a long-standing history that needs to be healed. And I hope the federal, provincial, and municipal governments use the Articles of UNDRIP to participate in the healing of these treaty relationships. Clearly, the way in which the federal government engages and meaningfully consults with not only the national organizations, but the rights holders needs to be improved in the development of the action plan. Honourable Senators, Bill C-15 is a framework to promote the self-determination of Indigenous peoples within the Canadian legal and social context. It's about creating the methodical, thoughtful, and respectful spaces where Canada can work with Indigenous peoples to harmonize federal laws with the Articles of UNDRIP. It's also about creating an action plan where we can work collectively on the deeply entrenched systemic issues that continue to cause trauma and trauma-based outcomes in Indigenous communities. Bill C-15 calls on the Government of Canada to do all of this in consultation and cooperation with First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous and Inuit peoples. Bill C-15 acknowledges and builds upon Section 35 of the Constitution. It embraces the jurisprudence regarding the government's duty to consult, and it reiterates that Canada must use the Declaration to interpret Canadian laws. Unfortunately, when many Canadians hear the phrase Indigenous self-determination, the information is always in the context of major projects and the definition of consent. We appear to be stuck in an FPIC rut and unable to discuss UNDRIP in any other context. I happily offer another way to think about the implementation of the Declaration. Honourable Senators, in February, we were seized with a bill that had many of us, properly so, discussing suicide and the services we need to address mental health issues. Many of us spoke passionately about Indigenous peoples in this context and the need to have culturally appropriate interventions. Interestingly, in 1998, authors Chandler and Lalonde published the findings of a study whereby they noticed that when considering British Columbia's nearly 200 Aboriginal groups, some communities showed suicide rates 800 times the national average, while in others, suicide is essentially unknown. And they wanted to find out why. So they investigated specific indicators in those communities, such as self-government, land claims, ownership of their own culturally based police, health, cultural, and social services. They found that communities that have taken active steps to preserve and rehabilitate their own cultures were those in which youth suicide rates are dramatically lower. Each of the 6 markers of cultural continuity were found to be associated with a clinically important reduction in the rate of youth suicide. That is all to say, what they found is that a powerful way to address hopelessness, helplessness, and powerlessness that Indigenous youth experience living in communities that are struggling under the Indian Act is to create the space for the self-determination of those communities. Bill C-15 calls the Canadian government to harmonize existing and future Canadian legislation with the UNDRIP articles to create all the enabling legislation we require to finally repeal the Indian Act. For my colleagues that are concerned about economic development, UNDRIP compels Canada and industry to bring Indigenous people to the decision-making tables at the very beginning of a project. Working within this consent framework ensures that all concerns are equally weighted and solutions include all perspectives. Rather than a veto, it provides a viable, logical way to get to a project approval. Bill C-15, therefore, would enable enhanced participation of Indigenous communities in the Canadian economy, which would over time help to create stronger and healthier communities and contribute to job and economic growth, ultimately benefiting Canada as a whole. Working within a consent-driven framework is perhaps the only practical way to move important projects forward now and in the future. It's true that there is a desire from both Indigenous and industry leaders to find a definition of FPIC. It's also true that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We only need to look at the work between Indigenous communities and LNG in Canada to see how UNDRIP would work. In addition, the International Global Compact demonstrates how companies can operate in ways that meet standards in the area of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. Over 13,000 businesses have already joined the Global Compact, including many Canadian companies. As this is a second reading, I'd like to quickly provide an overview of the purpose of the bill, the obligations it sets out, and how amendments made in the other place have strengthened the bill that is now before us. Clause 4 outlines the bill's purpose. It affirms the Declaration as a universal international human rights instrument with application in Canadian law. This recognizes that the UN Declaration can be used to help interpret Canadian law, just like other international human rights instruments. In this way, Bill C-15 reflects existing practice and legal principles that are already being used by the courts today. I want to be clear, Bill C-15 would not transform the UN Declaration into Canadian law itself. This means that the Declaration would not become legally binding and that it would not be directly enforceable by Canadian courts. At the same time, the second purpose of Bill C-15 is to provide a framework for the Government of Canada's implementation of the UN Declaration. This framework has two dimensions. First, the Government of Canada would begin the revision of laws to reflect the standards set out in the UN Declaration, while at the same time also respecting the rights that are already recognized and affirmed in Section 35 of the Constitution Act. Honourable Senators, this process will take some time and will support self-determination and the exercise of self-government, moving us toward a day that the Indian Act will be obsolete. I would remind the Chamber that this work is already underway, and as of April 2020, 9 federal laws already referred to and were created within the spirit of the UN Declaration. Secondly, once Bill C-15 comes into force, the Government of Canada is required to work in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples to prepare and implement an action plan to achieve the objectives of the UN Declaration. While the specific content of the plan will be developed collaboratively, the bill sets out broad minimum standards that must be included in the plan. These include measures to address injustices, combat prejudice, and eliminate all forms of violence, racism, and systemic discrimination, including systemic racism against Indigenous peoples. Measures that promote mutual respect and enhance our understanding through human rights education, and measures relating to monitoring and accountability. In describing these requirements, the bill highlights that we must consider the specific needs of elders, women, individuals who identify as two-spirited or otherwise representing gender diversity, children and youth, and people with disabilities. Through consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples, these minimum standards will be elaborated upon and turned into a plan for action. The action plan will also include measures for monitoring the implementation of the plan itself and for reviewing and amending the plan. This means that the plan can be updated and adjusted over time as priorities changed. Honourable Senators, if we've learned anything from the past year, it is that we must be able to adapt to change globally, nationally, regionally, or even local circumstances. In response to Indigenous witness testimony, Bill C-15 was also amended at committee in the other place. The amendments include the timeline for the development of the action plan from 3 years to 2 years. This is a welcomed amendment heard from witnesses, Indigenous leaders, and partners. The addition of specific references to racism and discrimination, including systemic racism, in Clause 6 of the bill. To ensure consistency, the same language was also added to the preamble. Adding specific references to the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius in the preamble paragraphs referring to all doctrines, policies, and practices based on ideas of racial superiority. Explicitly referencing these doctrines reinforces that the doctrines have no place in informing our ongoing relationships with Indigenous peoples. The addition of an acknowledgement in the preamble that Canadian courts have stated that Aboriginal treaty rights are not frozen in time and are capable of growth and evolution, which aligns with the recognition of the role of Section 35 as a key component of the Canadian constitutional framework. And finally, the last amendment was adopted as a grammatical change in the Purposes Clause, Clause 4. And so finally, colleagues, I want you to know that the process of formally implementing the Declaration is long overdue. As the great one, number 99, famously said, you have to skate to where the puck is going. Canadians are Canadians are ready for the implementation of UNDRIP and Bill C-15 is truly a reflection of what the majority of Canadians already believe. In a 2020 NANAS poll, it found that almost 2 out of every 3 Canadians agree or somewhat agree that the Government of Canada should implement the declaration. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, after speaking with over 7,000 survivors, as well as historians, legal experts, and public servants, issued 94 calls to action for healing and reconciliation, part of a substantive report about the intergenerational effects of residential schools on Indigenous survivors and their families and communities. The TRC called upon federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to fully adopt and implement UNDRIP as a framework for reconciliation. Colleagues, Bill C-15 is a concrete legislative response to the findings of the TRC. The TRC also called on all faith groups in Canada to formally adopt and comply with principles, norms, and standards of UNDRIP as a framework for reconciliation. Since then, the Canadian Council of Churches, representing 25 member denominations and more than 85% of the Christians in Canada, has supported UNDRIP and more recently supported Bill C-15. The Centre for Israel and Jewish Affairs Canada also published a letter supporting UNDRIP and Bill C-15. There is indeed broad faith-based support for UNDRIP, such as a coalition called Faith in the Declaration, which comprises of Canadian faith houses and organizations working together to support the implementation of UNDRIP. Faith in the Declaration has stated that Bill C-15 provides the federal government with a framework to create the paradigm shift required for a reset, a framework to build trusted working relationships with Indigenous nations and communities that are essential for the pathway away from colonization. Colleagues, church support for UNDRIP is important. For over a century, religion was used as an instrument of colonization. Children were abducted, forced into residential schools, and taught that their spiritual expression, the understanding they had of the Creator and of all creation, was heathen and a form of evil. It is significant that the same churches who led the spiritual colonization of children have not only apologized for their actions, they are also taking action to raise awareness and support the right of Indigenous people to be free from assimilation in Article 8 of the Declaration, the right to practice their traditional beliefs through Article 12, and the right to educate their own children through Article 14. This is reconciliation in action. In conclusion, it is time to commit to upholding and protecting the human rights of Indigenous peoples and to collectively address the impacts of colonization and systemic racism and discrimination. It's time to meaningfully respond to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action, as well as the report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. It is time to honor the UN Declaration and continue to renew and strengthen the nation-to-nation, Inuit Crown, and government-to-government relationships. The time has come to formalize our commitment and create a framework that sets us on a path towards real reconciliation. Honourable Senators, I thank you in advance for the contributions that this chamber is about to make towards the study of Bill C-15. Hi.